Communities webinar. Today's webinar is titled Statewide Complete Street Efforts. How states are working with communities for friendlier roads. And we will be speaking with Stephanie Seskin, Deputy Director for the National Complete Streets Coalition, Lauren Blackburn, Director of the North Carolina Department of Transportation's Pedestrian and Bicycle Division, Paula Reeves, Manager of the Community Design Office within the Washington State Department of Transportation, and Chris Behrens, a Senior Planner with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. My name is James Gallagher, and I am the PBIC Communications Manager. I will be facilitating today's webinar. All right, now I'd like to welcome and thank Stephanie Seskin, Lauren Blackburn, Paula Reeves, and Chris Behrens for their presentations today. We'll take questions at the end. Stephanie, please take it from here.
Thanks, James. All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm here to sort of set up all of our great speakers from the state DOTs on their work. So I'm speaking more broadly. Of course, when I'm talking about 50 different states, I can't get too specific. Some states are really doing really great work, and I think you'll hear some of that from the other speakers. So I wanted to start off by first talking about complete streets generally and giving some broad background information about it and how states are growing in a more complete streets direction in terms of their project delivery systems. So complete streets is an approach to transportation decisions. It's an approach, it's not an outcome. And it's especially important in the planning and engineering realms. And what we're looking to do is to create safe, comfortable, and convenient places for walking, driving, bicycling, and taking public transportations. Sometimes it is conflated with a physical output, a street with specific elements, and it's often envisioned in a somewhat narrow way that doesn't recognize the variety in transportation needs and land use contexts. So this is an example of where someone was really excited about making a complete street, but didn't really think through what the land use looked like and what the transportation needs might be. And instead thought, it's bike lanes, it's sidewalks, it's travel lanes, it's some trees, and just threw them in there. Complete Streets is about balancing those needs appropriately and approaching every project from the mindset that people will walk and bicycle and drive in these places. So it's reversing that burden of proof. You don't have to prove that people are going to walk there. You're already assuming that they are going to be, and in fact, most of the time, they already are. So one of the things that I think is a great reason for us to be pursuing complete streets is what we know about trips taken in our communities. Most of the trips are not commutes. They are to other places in our communities. They're to our schools, shops, friends, family, and that commute trips are also not just driving or just one mode. A lot of times they are multiple modes. So those little pieces of those trips are important to accommodate as well. Most trips in urbanized areas are 3 miles or under, and that includes those trips of walking to a bus, for example. Despite the fact that so many of these trips are relatively short, the majority of them are made by car. And it's these short trips in cars that cause capacity issues on our streets. And these short trips, we can take them by other modes. They're a great opportunity for walking or biking. And if the facilities are comfortable and connected and feel safe, people can take those other modes and increase the capacity of our roads to accommodate all of these trips that are taking. For us at the national level, I just want to talk through some of our terminology that we use so that I'm clear when I'm saying these words. Policy, as we define it, is pretty broad. It's any formal document that clearly shows a vision and intention to be inclusive while making transportation decisions. And inclusive means people of varying ages, abilities, incomes, preferences, races, and ethnicities. It means people who are walking, bicycling, taking public transportation, driving cars or trucks or emergency response vehicles. It also means thinking about the land use. In efforts to be interesting and very word choice, we and I often use accommodations or talk about accommodating all modes. But I think that's a little not the best word choice. The goal with Complete Streets isn't to appease some users by providing a facility. It's to make trips by all these different modes possible and make them safe and make them comfortable. The mindset of just accommodation, in quotes, can and has resulted in minimum facilities for walking and biking. And of course, most people won't want to bike in a 5-foot painted lane next to multiple lanes of traffic that are moving at 45 miles an hour. And that's not that you're accommodating it, but you're not really creating a viable alternative for people to get around in the communities. So just wanted to be clear that when I say accommodations, I don't mean it in this way. So statewide, we've got a lot of states who have committed to Complete Streets. We have 27 of them, plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. In 17 of those states, there's legislation that mandates a Complete Streets approach from the Department of Transportation, or in California's case, from municipalities and counties that are doing their general plans. In 15 states, there are policies adopted by the Department of Transportation. There's some overlap between the states that have legislation and the states that have policies, and there are also states that have design guides or other types of documents. But these are the key policies that have been adopted at the state level. Legislation tends to be direct and focused on the core of the Complete Streets concept, which is providing for all these different users in the project development process. They do tend to be shorter and don't give a whole lot of information other than the legislature wants the department to do this. Policies that are adopted by the DOTs themselves tend to be much longer, more detailed, take that vision that they come up with either internally or that is given to them through legislation, or that they work on with their community partners, and come up with something more comprehensive that includes some technical details, talks about networks, talks about what the project process is like, and most of the time does a pretty good job of touching on all the places that Complete Streets approach is applicable and can help improve walking, biking, taking transit, and driving in communities. So even though we're doing really great on the policy side and I think people are getting it, there's still some challenges in making Complete Streets a reality. I think you've got a Department of Transportation with hundreds of thousands of people working for you across the state. So there are just those logistical pieces of trying to get everyone to understand what it means in their day-to-day work. And so that's understandable. But I think one of the first challenges is that Complete Streets really is more than walking and biking. I know that's what we talk about a lot, but we talk about that because we feel that by making places nicer for walking and biking, it often makes it nicer for people who are traveling in cars as well. And of course makes it safer for everyone. And because it is more than biking and walking, because it is an approach, it is a holistic approach to transportation project development, the challenges in implementing Complete Streets and working across the state and working with local jurisdictions are pretty much the same as other general challenges that states are facing currently. For example, our long-term planning process is broken. We don't do a very good job of thinking long-term when we're doing these kinds of plans and going through our project processes. And I think some of this is because we are lacking vision, and that's not just from the engineers, but that's from everyone, planners definitely, politicians, businesses, residents. Sort of status quo, let's just keep going, just keep assuming that people are going to be the same, that they're going to have the same preferences, and that automobile trips are going to keep growing, even though we know that housing preferences are changing, travel choices are changing, and people aren't driving as much as they used to. And I'm not saying that people are going to stop driving. People will continue to drive, and I think we need to keep that as a reality. But right now, we're not presenting any other real alternatives in our plans. or to a great extent in our actual work and our projects. And it's sort of a self-perpetuating decision process where we assume always that there will be an increased need for automobile capacity, and so we keep building the same kinds of things, and then we come up against the same issues that we're facing as a country financially. So I'm here as a representative from the National Complete Streets Coalition to ask what if our projection instead is safe, comfortable, connected networks for other types of travels, especially if the communities are asking for it, so that if we consider automobility in concert with other demands for access in the community, what comes out of it? If our goal is for kids to walk and bike to school every day and feel comfortable and confident doing that, what changes then in our process, and how do we make sure that our streets help us achieve that goal? So one of the things that states are facing is that there are just too many projects in our plans and in the pipeline. And one of the first things to do in a Complete Streets implementation is to reconsider all of those projects that are in the plan. When were they first conceived? Do those realities still hold true? Are the goals still the same? And really, be kind of brutal about it and think about where we want to go as a state. Another thing that we need to do is be more rigorous with our cost-benefit analysis and our performance measures. On the cost-benefit analysis side, we often pick a big, massive project that is projected to improve some travel time or reduce capacity, or improve capacity and reduce congestion in some way, without thinking through if there are other ways that we could achieve that same end goal. And some of those other things might be less expensive and be better integrated into our communities. So one thing that we can do is right-size our projects or eliminate them from these plans. So pulling them down to size, making them more affordable, both in terms of construction and the ongoing maintenance concerns that we have. And then get rid of other projects that maybe we don't actually need anymore based on some of the other decisions that are happening. And it's hard. This is where one of the challenges exists in working between local governments and state level, is just making sure that the locals are planning for something and they don't tell anyone else, and there's a lack of communication, and that's something that we all need to be better at. And some of that happens through being more engaged in a project selection process and developing real criteria and being thoughtful about what projects do we actually want to fund, who is involved in deciding what those projects are, and is there something else that we can do to make sure that we are getting the biggest bang for our buck. States can also be a role model in design. I know some states, like Virginia, for example, they have most of the roads in the state are controlled by the Department of Transportation, and other states, like New Jersey, states really only have control over a small amount of the network. But in any case, the state DOT influence really is felt in every community through the guidance and documents that the state DOTs develop and work into their training and message to the local communities. Interestingly, in talking with people working in local governments and people working in state DOTs, I've found that both excitement about Complete Streets and wanting to make it happen, as well as some reluctance about how exactly it works, have led to some lackluster results in having a really rigid interpretation of what the design is supposed to be. The standards are created and they're duplicated, but the mindset of this is what we're trying to achieve with our communities isn't. That context sensitivity and the design flexibility can be lost in implementation, and it doesn't create good streets in our communities, and it doesn't foster a good relationship between these agencies when we're too rigid about it. And so it's difficult. It's a lot of conversations, a lot of meetings, it's a lot of talking to the community members, and it takes longer, but I think in the end it comes out with a much better process, and that's something that still feels new in a lot of places. By consolidating and updating design guidance at the state level to be clear and practical and multimodal, it really helps both the state and the localities implement the best solutions by giving them a common groundwork. They both need to use the most up-to-date and modern design guidance, All of those standard materials from AASHTO and NACTO and ITE and the MUTCD, and all of those need to be distributed. Everyone needs to know what's in them, where to look, and how to implement it together. I think if the states don't have the most up-to-date and modern design guidance, they at least need to allow the local governments the flexibility to go above the standard baseline that is established by the state, give them leadership and flexibility. Roads in communities are different than roads between communities, so design guides need to reflect that. Local requests for traffic calming or trees or cycle tracks or better transit designs shouldn't be met with a no from their partner agencies, but should be thought from as like a yes, how can we work together on this? And so state guidance and processes shouldn't preclude these solutions and shouldn't make doing something like this streetscape a design exception. This is what we should be working towards, and it should be easy, and there should be fewer paperwork that needs to be distributed to make these kinds of streets happen. So state routes and designs, it's okay if they're not the most perfect situation for automobiles. They often provide some suboptimal situations for non-automobile modes, especially when you're looking at the network. Mid-block crossings, trail crossings, facilities that get dropped or reduced at intersections because of intersection design guidance from the state. And those are tricky because when the locality is trying to build a network and a state road is in the middle, that can be a real barrier to making that local network work. So there's more communication that's needed there, and some flexibility in making sure that what the locals really want to do, if it goes above those standards, it can happen. Another key thing to think about in creating a better partnership is rethinking what the funding situation looks like. States should be scaling back on the number of really large capital projects that they're doing and focusing more on system management and maintenance. But of course, we'll still need to rebuild streets and retrofit those that we have that aren't meeting our goals. So there are that obviously impacts how we fund projects and what that selection criteria is like. But there are some other things that I think are kind of neat that we could do. Competitive grant programs, understand that there's expertise and readiness in local communities and let them show it off. They know their context, they know their current and future needs, give them the flexibility to implement great projects. A really good example is the Pennsylvania Community Transportation Initiative. When they were launching their smart transportation approach, they had a $60 million program. They attracted hundreds of grant applications from local governments and regional agencies, and they challenged them to demonstrate the values of that smart transportation approach. And I think that was a great way to collaborate and then to also show what the possibilities are in the state and give those locals that that leading role. Another thing that can happen is rethinking what the cost sharing is for non-automobile improvements. If walking is part of a comprehensive system, if it is fundamental to our transportation networks, why are these facilities treated differently than travel lanes? And just rethink how that works. In Tennessee, they have a multimodal access grant program where the projects are state funded at 95% with a 5% local match. And these are for projects that cost under $1 million, and that's kind of in line with what you would expect for a biking, walking, complete streets, active transportation elements that are pretty inexpensive comparatively, and that's a neat way to rethink that cost sharing issue and to let locals build sidewalks and bike lanes where they feel that they're necessary. The other thing that I think is really key is working together on data collection and using it to support a walking and biking safety emphasis in the strategic highway safety plans. That opens up additional HSIP money to those modes, and that's federal money, so that's coming through, and that's a great way to fund these projects. Not to mention that improving safety for active transportation often means improving safety for everyone. I think some states are being asked by their advocates to spend their HSIP funds in proportion to the non-motorized fatality and crash rates that they're seeing. So if you have 13% non-motorized fatalities, you're spending 13% of your HSIP funds on that. I'm not saying that's the way to go, but I think it's an interesting idea and something, a pot of money that hasn't been fully realized for walking and biking elements in the Complete Streets framework. The other thing to know is that land use happens. You can't ignore it and hope that it goes away. Developing joint transportation and land use corridor studies is a really good way to make sure that the transportation investments match what the community is planning in terms of where things are going to be located and what they are going to be and how close they are. The DOT doesn't need to do that land use planning, but it helps to recognize that that transportation work isn't happening in a vacuum. As more effectively leverages our taxpayer investments. It responds to local needs and plans. It really helps make sure that you know what's in the regional plans, that you can work together. And I think it helps identify outside groups who can bring more project dollars to the table through public-private partnerships and to pay for some of those more expensive and nicer elements of fancier streetlights, lots of trees, better community outreach. And integrated corridor management. Of course, off-system activities are relevant to the state system, and that's another way to make sure that you're working closely together and making the best of the transportation investments. And then as a whole, I think everyone needs to improve communication. What you're doing, what your plans say, how you're spending your money, that stuff needs to be easy to access. It needs to be understandable to people who are not the ones who are making those documents. So clear, avoiding jargon, and being upfront about the process is for how things are decided and put into those documents. And that includes the state transportation improvement plans, as well as capital improvement plans and programs. And then partnering with local governments and regional agencies to make sure that that public input is meaningful, both on projects and defining what the success for a project is, but also on plans and other more visionary elements that the state can agree to and then align their processes to meet those. So that's a very basic introduction to state-local relationships and implementing Complete Streets. And I will hand it over to Laura now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Lauren Blackburn. I'm with the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the training work that we've been doing as a department based on our policy and some recent planning and design guidelines. The Complete Streets policy that North Carolina passed as a Department of Transportation was passed in July of 2009, and you can download most of these materials on our website for the project, www.completestreetsnc.org. Within the guidelines, you can see the full policy document as well as the design and planning guidelines that we've been highlighting over the last year. The planning and design guidelines were completed in July 2012 after a couple of years of pretty strenuous committee work with local government as well as state DOT officials. Of course, we define Complete Streets similarly to what a lot of other folks do, is that it's our approach to providing an interdependent multimodal system for that is safe for all modal users and to provide access to the places that they want to go. There's a lot of information in our policy guidance in the document if you want to read more about some specific parameters about where it applies. Of course, the goals are very similar to what the previous speaker was just talking about. It supports transportation choices first and foremost. It provides ideally, it will provide the network for folks to be able to use bicycling, walking, and transit as a means of connected, efficient transportation. It also supports improving safety for those modal users. I think one thing that we're also being fairly focused on is the economic impact of Complete Streets, where they've directly been attributed to increasing businesses and residential property values, for example. Obviously, there's a connection to public health by providing those access to those facilities so folks can enjoy a more healthy lifestyle. It also allows for local community building. As a project is being built, it just really facilitates a lot of different partners to work together. And lastly, it supports environmental goals by reducing miles traveled and improving air quality. The whole Complete Streets concept is based on context, of course, which in DOT speak is ultimately going to get to some kind of functional classification or definition of a facility. So we've spent the majority of these training sessions that I'll talk about in just a moment talking about how the different functional classifications that we've been using for the last 50 years can relate back to some land use contexts that local governments are more familiar with. So we've developed a whole vocabulary as part of the Complete Streets program to help bridge that gap. The planning and design guidelines documents are organized in several chapters, and there's a lot of helpful introductory material, of course, at the beginning. Oh, okay, sorry. Let me get back there. Okay. The planning and design guidelines have various chapters, and the main part of it is the chapters which are devoted to how one scopes out or plans the facilities that are under development, as well as some other engineering focus areas. These excerpt pages are from the planning chapter, some illustrations which show potential cross-sections or plan views of how streets may function and how they may look. They're divided not into your traditional cross-sections where you have very specific widths per lane, for example, but they're divided into zones. So you'll see in our illustrations, you'll see a sidewalk zone or a green zone or a parking zone or a bicycle zone as how you build your facility. There are cross-sections, but again, they are ranges of feet per lane width, for example, and they relate back to that land use context. And so they provide some flexibility for planners and designers to have a conversation to get to a more specific width for each piece of the corridor. And we also have intersection improvement diagrams to help folks plan through that as well. The training program, again, built on that planning and design guideline manual, and it isn't enough, of course, to publish and produce. We knew we had to reach out to the various planners and designers, not just within NCDOT, but a lot of local partners as well. So we collaborated with our planning branch and many others in the department to develop a fairly comprehensive and very rigorous training program. In 2012, we organized 4 regional workshops. The purpose of those were really to help folks be aware that we were going to have some training courses, and also to highlight the economic, health, environmental impacts, and so forth in specific communities where Complete Street projects had already been implemented. For example, we had roundtable discussions with business owners, local politicians, bicycle advocates, and so forth to help provide some perspective about why Complete Streets is important to them. In 2013, we completed 24 separate 2-day training courses across the state. I'm sure as many other state Department of Transportations cover vast geographic areas. We were very intentional to place at least one of these training courses in each of what we call highway divisions in North Carolina, so that we had an opportunity for all of the engineers and planners in each of those regions to have at least the availability or some location close proximity to their main office to be able to attend. Overall, we had around 600 participants in the training program in 2013. A good chunk of those were NCDOT employees. We were very intentional about how we even spaced out the seating availability for them, so we were really focused on getting a lot of our planners and designers to the table. So we're really pleased with that. And in fact, we had wait lists at many of those training sessions, so we were able to add 3 more in 2014, which we weren't originally intending to do, but we were able to do that. We just started the first of the 3, and we're going to have wrapped up the 3rd by mid-May. And one thing that we've learned through these training sessions is that local planners and engineers are not only interested in learning about these case studies on NCDOT roads, but they're also looking at ways that they can develop local policies that can complement what we have at a statewide level. So we're going to develop a one-day training event in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we're going to bring together various partners to talk about a variety of things about local policies, for example, ways that they can network and share ideas, but also to discuss some of the next frontier issues and concerns. So our Complete Streets Planning and Design Guidelines was a comprehensive effort, and it spent a lot of time as a committee discussing what we can include, but it's certainly not exhaustive. It doesn't include every type of bicycle facility that you would find in NACTO, for example. It was what the North Carolina Department of Transportation and the Complete Streets Committee felt comfortable as a good step forward, but there's obviously a lot of new innovative facility types that haven't been directly addressed in the planning program or planning design guidelines, so we'll use this one-day event to talk about some of those emerging trends. And of course, a big part of that design process or that training program is all about process. The planning and design guidelines has great illustrations, but we spend a lot of time helping people understand that this is not a one-stop public involvement period. It happens periodically throughout the planning process, at the beginning, in the middle, and near the end, to give sufficient opportunity for local governments as well as public citizens to be able to provide their feedback so that we're more well-informed in the design part of that. So it will be a change for the folks who do project management for the department, the division and the statewide level. And it will be a change for local governments as well to give them more opportunities. But we're really excited about being able to make this change happen. Won't happen overnight, but we're really excited about the beginning stages. And I'll talk through a couple case studies that we've highlighted in the training. I won't go into a lot of detail, but these are some of the examples that we illustrate during the training sessions. There's an event or a highway in Boone, North Carolina, which is up in the high country part of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, and it's also a college town where NCDOT was going to be widening a corridor. And after several discussions and several years as well of trying to consider and weigh the different options, the department was able to work with the locals to develop a complete street and a radical transformation of the corridor that we know as US 421, not only providing multimodal facilities, but also allowing the local government, partly through some cost sharing, to be able to enhance and embellish the facility so that it had some a local character and local sense place. Another example is in Clayton, North Carolina, in the eastern part of the state, a small town, again illustrating that we work very closely with small towns, in particular on complete street projects. So this is a streetscape project where they're able to really enhance the pedestrian environment and bring more pedestrian patrons to their downtown business district. And I'll end here with this photograph. We didn't just spend a lot of time in classroom settings going through presentations and example case studies, but we allowed for folks to be able to get out in the field. This is a photograph of one of the field visits where we encourage folks to be able to learn more about what it is to be a disabled user and to understand more about some of the challenges on our roadways. So this is a photograph of one of the participants using a wheelchair and learning more about how it feels to be in that environment. So we feel like the program so far has been really successful in getting folks trained and educated. Again, it's just the beginning, and I'm sure there will be future training programs to go in the future. And that's it for me.
All right, now we'll hear from Paula Reeves.
Thanks, James. My name is Paula Reeves, and I manage the Community Design Assistance within Washington State DOT's Local Programs Division. I'm going to focus today on our systems analysis and how that is supporting other reforms within Washington State DOT. In local programs, we're the branch of DOT that stewards the federal funding, and we also receive state funding for programs like Safe Routes to Schools and pedestrian bicycle safety. We provide technical assistance services to DOT and to our other transportation partners across the state. In community design, our grant programs and technical assistance services are geared towards finding a better balance between the need for motor vehicle mobility and community access and livability. A recent example of one of our projects is shown on the right side of the screen. It's a trail connection made in Bonnie Lake, Washington, between a large development of homes, single-family and multifamily, on one side, and the community schools on the other. For just under $1 million from a Safe Routes to School grant, this community was able to significantly reduce costs of providing school bus services and at the same time increase active transportation for students. For today's webinar, the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center asked me to discuss Washington State DOT's Complete Streets and Main Street Highway efforts that originated with a research project conducted in 2007 and finished in 2008. Washington State DOT selected this research project for funding because there was a growing recognition and awareness that there are sections of state highways that provide both local access and regional mobility. And at times, these purposes may be at odds. There was also increasing awareness that these locations are critical for both safety and livability. And we were seeing late-stage design changes on projects that were costly in terms of delay and scope changes. To be clear, Washington State DOT applies complete streets and context-sensitive design in all our projects. However, there is a recognition that some sections of state highways are more complex, with right-of-way constraints and multiple modes of transportation converging. And often there are safety risk concerns. And in this research project, we referred to these complex and often constrained locations as main streets. Okay, there we go. The research was conducted with DOT in conjunction with the University of Washington Storefront Studio program. That is within the Architecture College at the University of Washington. It had two parts, a state highway system analysis to define a subset of Main Street highways, and 3 case studies that tested the impacts of community design as part of project development. I'll talk primarily in this webinar about the systems analysis portion, but I should say that the community design case studies tested different ways of engaging the community in planning and design to determine if we could produce better and more implementable projects using different visioning tools like storefront studios, which make use of vacant storefronts along a corridor to post renderings and designs and solicit community feedback. So in the systems analysis piece of the research, we applied 2 sets of screening criteria to come up with a subset of about 7,000 miles of about 5,000 miles of our 7,000-mile state highway system. And these we called main streets. They again are those sections of state highway that have both a local access to business function as well as regional mobility. The first set of screening criteria was basic and removed segments that clearly were not main street highways like those that are access managed. The second set of screening criteria looked at more detail and, most importantly, locally adopted land use through analysis of both GIS data and photo log analysis of Washington state routes. And I found it interesting in this study that there was a statistically significant relationship between the age of the city was incorporated, and the presence of this Main Street highway. So if the city was incorporated prior to 1950 in Washington, it's pretty likely that it had a Main Street highway and a grid system supporting it. We produced a preliminary map of these 500 miles of our state system and have reviewed them with cities and our regional transportation planning organizations across the state. These Main Street highways provide local access as well as that regional mobility. A Main Street highway provides opportunity for these sections of roadway to promote economic vitality, infill, community development. the impetus for this research. This is widely transferable research because communities all over the U.S. are grappling with the issue of retrofitting Main Street highways. The research helped make the link between the goals of community revitalization, visioning and planning, economic development, and developing community partnerships and the need of DOT to make investments and improvements in the state transportation system for mobility and safety. And it took an important step forward advancing this discussion by using this consistent set of criteria statewide. It provides a benchmark for tracking investments and impacts and a strategic focus for community design efforts that DOT initiates with local agencies. And the study then also served as a foundation for the Complete Streets Act that passed in the state in 2011, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So why define Main Street highways? Many states have Main Street highway efforts underway, Oregon, Maryland, California, and a number of others doing really good work. What's unique about Washington's is that we stepped back and took this systematic approach. And as a result, it's possible to track performance and impacts of retrofits over time. The study evaluated 375 DOT projects constructed between 2003 and 2009 and found over 40 projects with scope and schedule changes that could have directly benefited from additional community design work and project development. In projects where there was delay or scope changes to schedule or budget, the cause of delay was reviewed. In many cases, scope changes were needed to address community needs and concerns. Specifically, there were cases where changes could have been avoided through additional upfront coordination and community design as identified by the project engineers. The average estimated cost avoidance per project was approximately $9 million or 30% of project costs. Another important finding was related to pedestrian and bicycle safety. We saw and continue to see a disproportionately high rate of collisions, 60% of fatal and injury collisions involving pedestrians and cyclists on state highways in Washington occur on these Main Street highways, these 500 miles, that make up less than 9% of the highway system. And that's just another indicator or validation that we have identified the right segments. So how are we using this information as we move forward? In 2011, the state legislature passed Washington's Complete Streets Act. The research served as a foundation for the Complete Streets Act, and advocacy organizations in our state like our Transportation Choices Coalition, Washington Bikes, and the Childhood Obesity Prevention Coalition, and others helped to pass that legislation and make the case for additional design flexibility legislation that passed the following year in 2012. Washington State DOT's Secretary of Transportation, Lynn Peterson, has developed a strategic plan for WashDOT that includes reforms to our design guidance and processes called practical design. And she's established a goal of improving coordination and community engagement. And I'll talk briefly about each of these efforts. The research helped us better understand Complete Streets as an infrastructure need and project development process versus the social engineering effort that some were very skeptical of initially. We've heard a lot of concerns that Complete Streets is not achievable if it means we're to accommodate all modes and all projects all the time. This discussion about Main Streets helped us initially to focus and explain the land use and transportation connection, and the fact that people have certain expectations for design and function of streets in urban settings that may differ from their expectations of more rural settings, for example. Washington State DOT is in the process of updating and refining design and traffic operations guidance to incorporate the Main Street Highway's design and operations needs. And we are developing more partnerships with local agencies and others in order to accomplish the community transportation goals. In December 2013, Washington State DOT endorsed and committed to adopt the National Association of City Transportation Officials Urban Street Design Guide, NACDO. We're currently developing a Main Street Highway section of WashDOT's design manual, and we've adopted a new policy on design speed. The Main Street section of our design manual is heavily influenced by NACDO Urban Streets Guide and ITE Walkable Urban Thoroughfares. It introduces the concept of target design speed, where design speed is the same as posted speed and anticipated operating speed. And it introduces incremental change in design vehicle selection to better accommodate all users. Lastly, the research really pointed out that in our state, where jurisdiction over city streets that also serve as state highways is a shared one, community engagement is critical in avoiding additional costs to scope, schedule, and budget. WashDOT has recently initiated a community outreach focused on our 6-year paving schedule. We are formally reaching out to cities, especially those with Main Street highways, in advance of WashDOT paving projects to develop partnerships for making ADA and other pedestrian safety improvements. And that concludes my overview of what we're doing on complete streets and main streets in Washington State. And you can access the Main Street study on WashDOT's website, and feel free to contact me if you want to talk about more details. And I'll turn that over to Chris.
All right, thank you very much. James, thanks for asking us to talk to you all today. I'm here to talk a bit about what Minnesota's been doing at the state level over the last couple of years, and primarily what we're trying to achieve this year. I'm not going to really be talking a lot about our projects. We've got a lot of great projects, but what we're really focused on right now is the process, and I think it was Stephanie who touched upon this, and it to me is kind of the key element for us to have success with this initiative is to establish a process that holds ourselves accountable. The first thing I wanted to do is provide everyone with a historical background on complete streets in the state. There are a number of different initiatives at the city and county level that we've been partnering with, but I'll be touching upon some of the high-level moments over the last couple of years with respect to complete streets. Then I'm going to explain our complete streets policy and technical memo, what we're currently doing with an emphasis on our newly developed project reports, which is a mechanism for evaluating what we're doing on each project we develop. So in 2009, MnDOT provided the state legislature with a feasibility study on implementation of a complete streets policy. And then in 2010, the legislature came back, provided us with a law requiring the state DOT to implement a complete streets policy, and developed through an advisory group a series of guidance and protocols. So in 2013, that outreach and policy development culminated with this creation of a policy and an internal tech memo for the agency. It really formalized some of the standards that we were already adhering to, but really provided a mechanism to hold us accountable throughout project development. And actually this was then the moment which kind of the stewardship of the Complete Streets Initiative in our DOT went to our design office, and in the office that I'm with, the Office of Transportation System Management, which is effectively our planning office. So the policy, what we've got here is the policy statement, which says that the DOT requires that the principles of complete streets are to be considered at all phases of planning and project development in the establishment, development, operation, and maintenance of a comprehensive, integrated, and connected multimodal transportation system. You know, a lot of states and cities and counties have very similar language, but that's kind of the foundation that we were starting with as we've kind of become the stewards of this initiative. And the interpretation of this language is really, I think, key and important for us as we develop the accountability mechanisms. So some of the key points of the policy, it is directly coming from the law, supported by the law, and affects virtually all phases of road activity. It is in step with MnDOT's 50-year vision and also our statewide multimodal transportation plan, which we adopted last year, and sets a goal of increasing transit, bicycling, and walking as a percentage of our trips, and looks to address preservation projects to the extent possible. Now, everyone that's working in this stuff knows that this is a very important component of complete streets, effective implementation, and one that I'm going to touch upon a little bit more that we're really grappling with. The policy goes on to explain exactly who is responsible for ensuring adherence to complete streets principles at all, on all of our projects. And we have our state design engineer as the designated authority to approve or deny any exemption from the requirements. And our statewide multimodal planning director is accountable for ensuring that we have effective means of monitoring individual project adherence and conducting program level evaluation. So as I kind of just mentioned, we have in the policy a couple of key exemptions from it, and a requirement for us to develop a means of evaluating whether or not a project warrants one of these exemptions. So you have users are legally prohibited from using the roadway. That one's pretty straightforward. Demonstrated absence of current and future need. Environmental or safety determinants outweigh enhanced modal access. Constraints related to local government opposition, and then an inability to negotiate operational or maintenance responsibility. So as I said, when MnDOT developed the policy, we needed a accompanying technical memo to provide greater detail for our staff and transportation stakeholders. In many ways, the policy is an outward external resource, and this technical memo is guidance for our staff, and it outlines key considerations that will be made during planning, project scoping, design, construction, and elaborates on those exemptions that I just noted and when they are warranted. We have kind of a statement that we have been trying to ingrain within our staff as we've been going through a pretty extensive outreach process, and that is that in the past, the question has often been, why do we plan for things beyond cars and trucks? And we're really trying to, and I think we've actually been doing this for many years now, but really trying to emphasize that the default has got to go towards why not. And it might sound a little bit cliche, but it really is, I think, been an effective way for us to kind of help people wrap their arms around how you should be beginning the conversation. Now, as many of you are dealing with yourselves, there's a lot of devil in the details. What type of documentation is needed? How do we approach preservation projects? And what type of analysis would justify a lack of future demand, and I highlighting a couple of these big questions that I think a lot of folks at all levels are grappling with. And when we were brought in last year to work on this implementation of the policy, we looked at where other transportation entities throughout the country were at. And, you know, we saw that a lot of folks, especially at the state level, have policies very similar to ours, but that a lot of folks are really grappling with how to hold some accountability for actually doing this stuff while simultaneously maintaining existing assets. And I think this is even more challenging for states that have a strong vein of movement towards design flexibility, context-sensitive solutions, which are trying to open up engineering and design requirements to be much more inclusive. And that is a really important tool for us, but it does create some challenges when developing ways for us to measure what we're doing and what we're not doing. And that really is kind of where our office has come in to this initiative, and what we're kind of focused on in a lot of ways. So to help with that, we set up a Complete Streets internal working group. It's made up of our offices that are really directly related to this stuff, and we've been conducting a pretty extensive outreach with our agency's staff in developing a way of empowering our project managers to design, but also a mechanism for accountability. And then externally, we have been developing a targeted communication plan, and we're referring to it as a targeted communication plan because a lot of what we're doing now is not really that initial, hey, we have a Complete Streets initiative and goal. It is really getting into the details and trying to hold ourselves accountable and explain to our transportation stakeholders what we're doing. So this is a little bit more illustrative for people who are in the transportation world, whereas some of our other stuff has been historically more oriented to a larger public audience. And then some other areas that we are focused on is the creation of a guidance document for our partners at the city and county levels, and then revising our bikeway facility manual, which we are now looking to have designated bikeways throughout the state, and then also a statewide pedestrian plan and freight system plan, which are designed to serve as resources for us to be doing that front-end planning so that when we get to the next steps, we've done that upfront work. As I mentioned, our key goal this year is to have a strong accountability mechanism, and this Complete Streets Policy Project Report, which you see in front of you, is in many ways our way of doing that. The purpose of the report is to document and track MnDOT's implementation. We're looking to roll this reporting tool out to the agency in May, and the current structure of the report is really trying to balance our dual needs of understanding how project managers are thinking about each individual project, as well as providing data that can be aggregated up and analyzed at a program level. And so it's been broken down into three areas. The summary looks to review key characteristics of the project that help explain the scope of work being done. The section is reviews the project type, a bridge replacement project, existing site characteristics, small urban, special roadway designations, which look to identify special functions of the roadway and user groups it's serving. And Then the second section is the overall project improvements. It's designed to highlight often used complete streets improvements on the roadway and categorically capture what the agency is doing for user groups on each project, without kind of placing an initial value on is this the right choice. It's more of what is happening on this project, and be able to understand and know that categorically. And then the third section, and this is in many ways the most important one, we have the provisions that are capturing the adequacy of existing user needs and how MnDOT will be addressing the needs of each user group. And this is broken down into pedestrian, bicyclist, freight, transit, and we've also established an other category for other relevant groups that might not typically be brought up. We're focusing on these areas. We are focused on all of our modes, but these are the user groups that the primary ones that we really want to be getting good data on. And this section, it's a narrative-driven format, and requires project managers to explain their approach to each user group in context. The goal is really to help us understand what's being done on the main section of the project in question, and what's being done for cross movements for users, and it provides you with basically kind of three options to respond. Existing conditions are adequately meeting a user need. Existing conditions are not adequately meeting a user need, and additional scope is being done to provide improvements to the system for that user group. And then existing conditions are not adequately meeting user needs and we are not doing something. And in this case, they will be looking to demonstrate one of the exemptions that I touched upon earlier, and providing a concrete descriptive reason of why they're justified in that assertion. So it really is an attempt by us to balance kind of a categorical descriptive look at at each of our projects, and also have the project manager be able to kind of describe in a narrative format the context involved, what's going on parallel routes, what is happening for each user group as it relates to the others. And the key here is that the projects will be, or project managers will be completing this. As I said, we're looking to roll this out in May at the initial charter stage, so that's 5 to 7 years out. When we initially scope a project, that's kind of the key moment when we're making a lot of decisions on what's in and what's out for a project. And then finally, we're going to be revisiting this document when we reach 30% final design. So really right when the project is about to get let. And by looking to do this at these 3 stages, we get to see how a project is evolving, what's happening in the outreach, and also allows the project manager to describe what they're thinking on a project. So, with that, that's kind of a snapshot of what we're doing. That it was really meant to be kind of an emphasis on this process piece that Stephanie, kind of highlighted. We do say, it's not an outcome, it is a process. We are looking at outcomes, but this kind of the stuff that we're really knee deep in right now is this process stuff. And if you want to see some of these supporting documents, I'd have you reference the web page that I have up there. And I guess with that, I think James is taking it back.
Yes, all right. So now we have some time for questions. If you have not done so already, please go ahead and enter your question in the question box, and we'll try to get through them. So the first question I have is, and I got this question multiple times, so I'm going to try and kind of combine it. Oftentimes, especially in urban areas, local streets do not connect. Does complete streets mean adopting another way of classifying streets, or does it mean improving connectivity among local streets?
This is Paula Reeves. I'll jump in and just say that I believe it would be both. I think it's important to look at connectivity and classifications, what might be appropriate in the setting that the facility is in.
Okay. My next question. Are Complete Streets guidelines federally mandated, and will they be implemented in all states, or is this a collaborative effort with certain states acting as of now?
Well, I'll take that. This is Stephanie, the National Complete Streets Coalition. Complete Streets is not federally mandated. There are. It is about individual communities and agencies working together to come up with the best solutions that balance the need for design flexibility, multimodalism, land use, and the best investment. There are national best practices, of course, and I think there are national organizations, many national organizations who are interested in this and who are working to support those local decisions.
All right. This question is directed at Lauren. Can any out-of-state entities get some training from NCDOT, and when will your event in Charlotte be taking place?
Good question. Yeah, I don't think we'd be able to provide training for anyone who doesn't work in the state or has a relationship with our state. And I will have to say that the next 2 training sessions, I think, are already getting pretty close, if not already filled up. So we're, again, really pleased with the turnout. It just demonstrates how much demand there has been for it. The Charlotte event is certainly open to anybody. It'll have limited seating. It's planned for late July. I don't think we've posted a lot of detailed information, but please consult the Complete Streets NC website for more information about that.
All right. Next question. How is accessibility for all users ensured throughout the year? Some areas of the country are challenged by winter weather, and winter public works activity has focused on snow removal on streets for auto traffic.
This is Chris Behrens. I guess maybe as the token northern person, maybe I should field this question. You know, this is something that we really do have as a problem, especially with some smaller communities that they might not have the resources to provide the maintenance. We have gone away from that as a, I would say, the only justification, and you know, it demonstrates that this this done in an effective way requires collaboration between, especially with DOTs, between city and county folks, and doing that planning early on. And that's kind of, you know, the reality of what we're trying to address.
Okay. This next question is for Paula. Can you comment on how local cities and communities reacted to expectations on cost sharing and maintenance of Complete Streets facilities?
That may be related to our outreach on our 6-year paving program. And the way we're approaching that, and I think in general, is just reaching out, saying there's an opportunity for partnership here. If if that is within your own capital facilities plan. In our bicycle and pedestrian planning process that occurred also back in 2008, it's time to revisit, but a lot of cities, we recognize that a lot of cities had identified in their capital facilities plans, in their long-range plans, the need for those improvements, and some had budgeted. So we're just trying to tap that and support that coordination. So in general, I think our initial response is really positive, that we're trying to coordinate in advance and give local agencies time to work their budget and any amendments that they need to make or might want to make.
All right. This next question is for Chris. Chris, how does Minnesota DOT handle interchanges of cross streets and highways with freeways? Are you squaring off the ramps, or are they rounded?
I'm sorry, can you say that last part again?
Or when you make the on and off ramps for highways and cross streets, are they rounded or are they squared off?
I mean, they're going to be different depending on you know, the context in question. I think this maybe is getting at a specific treatment for a roadway, and this is you know, kind of highlights what I was talking about earlier about design flexibility and us trying to empower our project managers and our design engineers to think critically about the throughput and also the cross movements and design accordingly. I think there's actually it's a double-edged sword, I think, with Complete Streets, where you want to make sure you're not being too prescriptive and saying you know, in this roadway you must do this and have a, you know, a template, but simultaneously you want to make sure that you have some level of an effective threshold. And I think that's, you know, why we're really trying to highlight this project report, because we want to be able to say, you know, what we're doing on a project and specifically why we're doing it. So, but in respect to a specific, you know, rounded or squared, we're really wanting to empower our folks to think critically about their projects.
All right, next question. Thank you, Chris. The next question for anyone who wants to answer. How do you overcome political barriers to Complete Streets? And how do you sell it to board members, the general public, and elected officials?
This is Lauren. One thing that we've found pretty effective, not just to politicians, but to anyone who has questions about the value of Complete Streets, is looking at it from a cost-saving perspective. So if they compare the cost of adding a widened bridge deck to put in a sidewalk and maybe some bike lanes now compared to trying to add those amenities in the future when there's not a bridge widening in the process, dramatically different costs. So we've really kind of looked at that as an opportunity for why Complete Streets is a financially smart move.
This is Paula Reeves. I completely agree with Lauren, and I would just add that also making that case that these improvements support community economic vitality and community development has helped.
And I'll add as well that it really depends on who you're talking to and what their interests are. That's how you get them on your side, is appeal to what they care the most about. I think a lot of elected officials are really interested in public health issues, and so you can come at it from, this is an opportunity to provide space for active transportation, get people moving in their daily life, and is an equity issue to make sure that people have choices. It's also, I think, growing And well, it's always been, to me, a safety issue, but I think that's coming to the fore again in terms of communicating with people about why this is important.
Okay. Are there any examples of complete streets policies at a state level that demand or require counties and municipalities to adopt a complete streets policy?
In California, as I mentioned, the state law is related to planning efforts, which are also mandated by the state. So they're, when they update their general plans, they need to incorporate complete streets approach into the circulation elements. Vermont also has a state law that applies to municipal concerns. But those are the only two that I know of. I don't think that in most cases it's appropriate for a state to mandate things from the counties or municipalities, but I think that there are opportunities to incentivize and encourage collaboration on complete streets goals across communities and regionally.
This is Paula Reeves from Washington State, and I agree with the comments Stephanie just made. In Washington, our state law created a grant program, and so we have more of an encouragement mechanism. And in the framework for that grant program, we ask in the application process if the local applicant has a complete streets policy or equivalent policies in place.
All right. Thank you very much. The next question. Is it known or have there been any studies to determine if auto, bicyclist, and or pedestrian accidents have been reduced in areas where complete streets have been implemented?
You know, this is Chris Behrens. We have we've helped fund a number of different research studies of late. There's been a lot of interest in this in our state. Specifically, we have a really strong bicycling community, and we have a study that came out a few months ago that looked at the effects, the safety impacts of implementing complete streets, and that I would say pretty uniformly showed that there was positive effects for not only historically maybe underserved user groups, but also pretty negligible impacts to motor vehicles. I think one of the only exceptions that they really highlighted was situations where you have both high speed and high volume, that narrowing lane widths was not seen as a particularly positive outcome, but pretty consistently we're seeing good outcomes from any communities that are implementing complete streets.
And I think that extends nationally to a number of municipalities conduct before and after studies more frequently now and are concerned with the safety and crash rates. A lot of times the facilities that are chosen as part of the complete streets approach are those that have that are backed up by lots of research, that are proven safety countermeasures, road diets, medians, things like that.
Yeah, and James, I'd be happy to provide you with that research that I just touched upon as well.
That'd be great. We'll put it on our website. All right. Next question is for Lauren. How successful have the training courses been, and how do you see the outcome of the training courses leading to more complete streets implementation?
Mm-hmm. Well, given that this is the first year of the training and the guidelines are relatively recent, our best measure of success was turnout at the events, and I think I've probably mentioned earlier, I'm very pleased with the level of participation by NCDOT employees as well as local government and private sector transportation professionals. They were very engaged, asked lots of great questions, and I think anecdotally we've heard that several folks who weren't necessarily experts in how to handle multimodal accommodations, they talked a lot about how they learned a lot about different ways of designing projects, and especially learned from those case studies is some different operational ways of handling it. So we're really happy with the level of response in that regard. I think time will tell about how much it shows up in our long-term planning and our long-term projects, but it's certainly just the beginning of a series of training events, and we're looking forward to following up with folks in maybe the next couple of years.
All right, thank you, Lauren. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Paula, this question is for you. Have you considered using HSIP funding on Main Street highways, and is that potentially an effective way to fund projects?
I'm sorry, I missed a few words in there. Can you just repeat that? I'm sorry.
Have you looked at using HSIP funding on the Main
right.
Street, and is that potentially an effective way to fund projects?
So in our state, so several years ago, our governor appointed a committee that made the decision to dedicate some highway safety improvement program funding to our bicycle and pedestrian program. So yes, we do make investments using HSIP in complete streets type projects now, and it's working well. We have some good examples, and I'd be happy to, if you want to email me, I'd be happy to share some before and after examples with you.
All right, thank you. And Paula's email address is there posted, so if you want to follow up with her, go ahead and email her. Our last question today: can anyone provide an example or two of how complete streets have been successfully implemented in very urban areas where there isn't much room to expand road widths?
I'll just speak broadly and let the others give more specific examples, but constrained right-of-way is something you have to think about, but it's not, it doesn't preclude a complete streets approach. What we're trying to do is be more inclusive from the start, so it's not necessarily always adding width to achieve our goals, but to rethink what we have and work within that. Pretty much every major urban city that you could think of is working on how to accommodate all of these modes within constrained corridors, so there are lots of great examples out there.
I would suggest possibly road diet solutions. You know, it's a proven safety countermeasure that is more widely discussed, and roundabout installations can help with capacity issues. Also, I think that we're starting to see more separated bicycle facilities, and the shared use path options in urban settings.
All right, well, thank you. I appreciate the news. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for discussion. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question today. Once again, a PDF copy of the presentation slides will be available later this week at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, and a recording of today's program will be posted to that site as well as to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/pedbikeinfo within a couple of weeks. Be sure to follow us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/pedbike for updates on when that video is available. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. We'd very much appreciate your time, you telling us a little about our performance today. And thank you again to our speakers, Stephanie Seskin, Lauren Blackburn, Paula Reeves, and Chris Behrens. And thank you to all of you for attending today's PBIC Local Communities webinar.